Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Greetings, Hydrogen Rising listeners. Glad to have all of our listeners back with us today. My name is David Walkner, and I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the global law firm K&L Gates and co-lead our firm's hydrogen practice. I am joined, as always, by my awesome co-host, Sandra Safro, who is Associate General Counsel for Energy and Technology Regulation at the Edison Electric Institute here in D.C. Hey, Sandy, how you doing?
Hey, David, doing well. How about you?
Yeah, good. It's a rainy day here in Washington. Just feels like we're waiting for spring a little bit. I'm excited about our episode today, Sandy. We are set to introduce a new entrant, I think, into the U.S. hydrogen space. We are joined today in the Hydrogen Rising studio by Carl Gannat, who is the Managing Director and CEO of the Champaign-Urbana, Illinois Mass Transit District. And importantly for our discussion today, Carl also serves as the president of the very recently formed first of its kind hydrogen coalition, the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Bus Council, or HFCBC. As Sandy, as you and I have talked about many times on Hydrogen Rising, hydrogen deployment is absolutely critical to help decarbonize the transportation sector, not just in the U.S., but globally. And so we're thrilled really to have Carl on the program today and hopefully help kick off the coalition's new effort. So Carl, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate being invited.
Absolutely. So, let's just start kind of with some of the basics about the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Bus Council, the mission, who the members are, and why now? What prompted you all to start this coalition?
Well, what really kicked it off is that the number of transit systems in the United States who are in the hydrogen technology user group is very, very small, in particular relative to the battery electric users. And so we happen to be a group of people who believe fairly strongly that the hydrogen fuel cell electric bus is, in most cases, superior to the battery electric bus. We think there's a place for a battery electric bus, but we think in most use cases that the fuel cell bus is better. However, the hydrogen market is many, many years behind the battery electric bus market. And we think that primarily is because battery electric vehicles have really gotten a boost over the last 10 years or so by the formation of Tesla and the billions of dollars that have been pumped into that company, but also the charging infrastructure at a loss because the owner of that company has the money to spend on that and he can take the loss.
Yeah.
Well, that really gins up the conversation and the interest in that technology when somebody is willing to do that. So that launched the battery electric vehicle ahead of any other alternative, and the bus market got swept up in that. And so the hydrogen technology market doesn't have an Elon Musk. It doesn't have a Tesla. And so not that we think that we are in that category, but we're just trying to do our little part in forming the council to be a voice for the technology, similar to how Musk and Tesla are the voice for the battery electric technology.
Carl, I think you gave me the greatest lead in I could have asked for the next question. As there's so much conversation in the hydrogen sector now around moving from the concept and the excitement that we've seen over the last several years to really implementation and putting ideas into effect in the real world. You touched on the pervasiveness of the infrastructure for battery electric vehicles and how that's really been a boost for that sector of the transportation economy. And so would be really interested in understanding what role the council anticipates playing in the build out of the fueling infrastructure for hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles and buses. And if you can give us a little bit of perspective on how you see that infrastructure developing. Are you thinking about it in terms of being hyper local development or something more like a corridor or broad regions? I'll turn it to you. Very curious for your thoughts.
The infrastructure, when it comes to public transit operations, the infrastructure has to come hand in glove with the vehicles. I'm stating the obvious, but you can't use the vehicles if you don't have the infrastructure to fuel them. So no transit system is going to get into the hydrogen fuel cell market without simultaneously getting into the hydrogen infrastructure market. Now, one of the beautiful things about hydrogen is that there are multiple modes of infrastructure. My transit district has chosen to go on the road of installing an electrolyzer, so we are producing our own hydrogen on site. And that's kind of the all-in approach, and that certainly is the most expensive approach, but I think we also get the biggest bang for our buck with that approach. But there are other approaches. You could have gas delivered. You can have liquid delivered. Transit systems have options, and they can scale that option for the budget that they can accommodate for that launch. So that's great, but you absolutely have to do the infrastructure when you do the vehicles. I mentioned Elon Musk earlier and Tesla spending billions of dollars to install chargers all across the nation because they knew that no one's going to buy that battery electric vehicle if they can't charge it when they're going from point A to point B. That is full stop. The cars are never going to take off. No one's going to buy them if there isn't an infrastructure. So at their own loss, they had to put that out there. And that's similar to the hydrogen market. Even stepping outside buses for a moment and thinking about cars, Toyota's got a great hydrogen fuel cell car. Who's going to buy it out of California because you can't get hydrogen anywhere?
Yeah.
And so Toyota's never going to sell that car in Illinois if there isn't a fueling infrastructure in Illinois for that car. So while that's a big hurdle, I do think it is mountable. We can get over that hurdle, but there has to be a version of what Tesla did with their chargers. There has to be a version of that for hydrogen. And one version of that can be transit systems who put their own systems in place and then grow to the point where they can market and make available to the public their hydrogen. We're not at that point, and we have nobody that we would make it available to, even if we were at that point right now. But those two things can happen simultaneously. Also, just from a car or over-the-road truck perspective or over-the-road bus, gas stations are our national infrastructure for fuel. And so if we can get those companies on board with hydrogen, and Love's Truck Stops is a great example of that. The owner of Love's really loves, pardon the pun, loves hydrogen. and so there's interest there in installing hydrogen infrastructure, and that starts creating this nationwide base where users can fuel up. So I think a lot of things can happen simultaneously, and I probably spun out of actually answering your specific question.
I mean, I think that's great. I actually have two follow-ups.
Yeah.
One, so I think I heard you say the idea is for the council to be a voice. I'm curious, what do you see the council doing? Like, how is the council going to be a voice? Is it a voice at the federal level with the federal government? Is it a voice perhaps with state governments or local municipalities? How do you guys see yourself as an organization advocating?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes to all of that.
All of the above, yeah.
So certainly primarily on the federal level. We have a variety of members from all across the country. And so we all have an interest in educating legislators and executive members on the federal level. That helps all of us be able to fund these projects because transit is dependent on federal support. So that's number one. As we do that and we're preparing materials for the federal level, then we have something in hand that we can also use on our individual state levels. Because most of us also use state support. So one follows the other. And then thirdly, on a local level, just speaking from my own experience and while we were launching our own local project, there are a lot of questions and a lot of people have concerns about safety. We have in Champaign-Urbana, we have the University of Illinois, which is a top tier engineering school. So we've got lots of people within the university who have knowledge about how the molecules work and that kind of thing, but they don't understand transit. And so they have questions about what the marriage is between those two things. So there's a lot of opportunity for educating on the local level too. So yeah, the answer is yes.
That's great. It is also the perfect segue to my second follow-up. You mentioned that, the Champaign-Urbana Metro Transit District made the decision to invest in, deploy, install your own electrolyzer. So you are producing your own hydrogen. I expect our listeners would be very interested, without getting into political details. What was that decision process like for a public sector facing organization? I mean, is that the kind of thing that a city council had to vote on? Was it an internal decision? I'd be very curious about that because I think a lot of communities across the country are struggling with this, trying to figure out how do we go forward and do we make that investment in an electrolyzer?
Yeah, so just focusing on MTD rather than the Fuel Cell Bus Council, we had a couple of goals in mind. One goal is we want to have zero emissions. And lots of people are talking about zero emissions, and many transit systems are adopting zero emission technology with battery electric buses. But in our community, if we're charging our buses on the grid overnight, then we're drawing power from the grid. And in Illinois, our grid is primarily powered by burning coal. And worse, it's dirty, high sulfur Illinois coal. And so that's not really zero emissions. It's zero emission at the vehicle, which is great, but it's not zero emission at the power plant. And so all you're really doing is moving the emissions. You're not zeroing them out. Our transit district has a long history of trying to maximize our sustainability. We are ISO 14001 certified, so we take sustainable measures very seriously. And so when we talk about zero emission, we want to really mean zero emission. So that was one goal. The second goal is very related to that is we want to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And again, if you're burning coal to power the grid to charge your buses, then you're not really reducing your fossil fuel consumption. You're just changing it. So we wanted to zero that out. And we've done that by electrolyzing water to produce the hydrogen. And we're powering that electrolyzation with a solar array. And so we truly are zero emission from the very beginning to the very end of the use of the product. It's zero emission along that entire continuum. And then thirdly, and I mention this third, not because it's the least important, but because it's the most important, we want to minimize or not create any negative ramifications to the core reason why we exist. We're a public transit operator, and we want our service to meet our customers' needs. We don't want to have to design our service to meet our vehicles' needs. Battery electric buses change the way that transit systems operate. You've got to restructure your routes and schedules so that you can charge, or so that you can accommodate shortened ranges of battery electric vehicles versus diesel electric vehicles. So with hydrogen vehicles, we don't have to do any of that. We can keep our routes and schedules functioning the way our riders, our community wants it to function, rather than what our vehicles need.
Carl, can you also just talk a little bit about what the footprint of your refueling infrastructure looks like relative to what it might look like if you were using battery electric vehicles for the bus fleets?
Sure. So again, keep in mind, we went all in, and we went with the most expensive option to get the biggest bang for the buck, but it's also the biggest footprint option. So, we've got the electrolyzer and all the associated gear with compressors and chillers and generators and all of that. And then we've got the storage tanks. That's a pretty big footprint, and we were lucky that we had the available land to do that. Some transit systems, one of our good friends and fellow council members and board members, in fact, in Canton, Ohio, they don't have as much available land, and so they had to shrink down what they did to launch their hydrogen project, and so they have their fuel delivered, and so they just have storage tanks. They have liquid delivered. They've got storage tanks to store that. And then they have a vaporizer to convert that to gas to put in the vehicles. So that takes a lot less space. And fortunately, it's less expensive too. So, it depends on what you can do, and you have options to work within that.
Your comment just before Sandy's last question about the customer needs, I think is really compelling. There is, and Sandy and I have talked a bit about this on the podcast, this kind of concept of, well, it's not a concept anymore, a kind of active opposition to hydrogen, right? This notion that it's just the extension of the fossil fuel industry. And we see a lot of hostility in it, despite what is very clear benefits to help in sectors that are very hard to decarbonize, right? Whether it's transportation, whether it's heavy industry, steel manufacturing, cement, things like that. And that focus on the customer, and I think it seems to me that can be a huge part of the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Bus Council's messaging, right? Your point about the need to reorient your system schedules, for example, because the buses can't go for as long. And if the routes are too long, you don't have adequate charging, they've got to recharge. All of that's interesting. So my question, the follow-up to that is, and as you know, I am born and raised less than an hour from Champaign-Urbana in Bloomington, Illinois. I'm kind of curious about the mindset of the public on this, and kind of your level of, have you had to engage in kind of significant stakeholder activities, stakeholder engagement activities with the public to explain what you're doing? And I guess for the council and your other members, what lessons can be taken away from that?
Yeah, you bet. There's been lots and lots of engagement with the public, and I think each of the members of the council would say the exact same thing. Though we probably all have done different forms of communication and education with the public, because I believe it's very unique to the local environment. For instance, we're a university town, and as I mentioned, our university has a big engineering school. So we've got a very scientifically oriented community and scientifically academic oriented community, and so they understand it, they get it, they know the science behind what we're talking about way better than I ever will. And God bless them for that. But like I said, they don't understand transit. And so I had, when we announced that we were doing this, I had, I don't know, I'm making up a number, but a dozen professors from the university contact me saying, don't do this, you're making a mistake. Battery electric is more efficient than fuel cell electric. And let me, Professor X, explain to you why that's the case and why you're wrong. So I said, great, let's get together. Let's talk about it. And every time they're right. They're 100% right that batteries are more efficient than hydrogen production. What changes the course of the conversation is that's fine, but when you're having to reorganize the way you manage your transit system and you provide a lesser quality of service to your customers and your community because of that, then what kind of efficiency are we really talking about? If you just look at a single data point, yep, batteries win. But if you look at the whole picture, I believe, and in every one of those cases of conversations with professors, they came away thinking, at least acknowledging, I get it. I understand why you made the decision that you did.
Yeah.
So, that's important. Now, in a community in California that doesn't have a university and they're going fuel cell, they probably just, their community is just wondering, is that safe? I mean, don't they fuel rocket ships with that? I mean, what's going on with these buses? And so then you just explain, we're not burning the hydrogen. It's a chemical process. It's very safe. And, so it's just a different kind of conversation.
Yeah. I mean, that conversion you talked about is interesting. I also think one of the challenges that we see is a bit of an ivory tower mentality, right? And not taking into account the user, the customer that you serve day in and day out, who relies on public transit in order to get to their job, to their doctor's appointments, to whatever it may be. So I think you're to be congratulated. I thank you and the council for taking this approach. It's pretty exciting.
Carl, I'm going to pivot a little bit here. There's so much discussion in the hydrogen sector right now around hubs and having multiple users come together and create a bit of a symbiotic relationship might be not the exact right way to describe it, but to sort of work together to promote the development of a hydrogen economy. Recognizing that the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Bus Council is in early days, I would just be curious if you could talk a little bit about what opportunities you see for growth of other sectors of the hydrogen economy as a result of the work that the council is doing, and recognizing that may be something that's midterm, longer term for you all at this point.
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right. And the council is not just, it's in our name that it's Hydrogen Fuel Cell Bus Council. And so that certainly is a focus. But really what we're trying to do is promote the entire hydrogen economy, the hydrogen market for economic advancement. And so that, we're not at 50-50. We have more public agencies that are members than private companies, but we're pretty close to 50-50. We've got a lot of private investment in this council, and it's from a wide variety of market segments within the hydrogen world. And so, yeah, we'd love to see a hub that is producing green hydrogen that can deliver that hydrogen to a variety of transit systems, which then, spins off into more business. And so that grows. And then Toyota can start selling their Mirai in central Illinois. We want to start lining up those dominoes so that we can start knocking them down. But we got to put them in place first. And that's something that the council can hopefully be proactive in doing as a singular voice from all these wide variety of members.
That's great. I love that visual of the dominoes too. I think that's a really good one. We had one last question for you before we wrap up. And I think as legal nerds, David and I couldn't help ourselves, but we promised not to ask you a legal question here, just legal adjacent. Very curious to get your thoughts on the hydrogen provisions in the recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure law, or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as it's also called. It seems like the council predates the passage of this infrastructure bill. And so we were wondering whether the passage of this legislation played into the council's timing or member interest, and if there are particular provisions that you all think would be helpful for your efforts as you look towards the future.
Yeah, broadly, the council does predate the passage of that bill, but it doesn't predate the conversation about the bill. And so there was some simultaneous activity about when the different legislation was being put together and the conversation about, gosh, we have a need here. And this is a great final question because we can go full circle to the very beginning of the conversation. We were talking about Tesla being this really defining voice for battery electric technology, and then transit systems adopting battery electric vehicle technology. So what happened because of that is that the battery electric technology got so advanced that when legislators talk about, hey, we need to provide funding for electric vehicles, they may have said electric, but what they always meant was battery electric. And so the legislation started twisting toward the direction of battery electric only, not really because anyone was opposed to fuel cell electric, but they never even thought of it. They may not have even known that it was an option. And so we started to be concerned that the hydrogen fuel cell market would be shut out of legislative provided funding, not because it was intended, but because it just never was thought of. And that's why we started talking about, we need a voice. We need a singular voice that can really say, hey, don't forget about us. There's a good reason to consider this as an option. And so, I mean, we can talk about specific funding pieces if you want, but broadly, that's why the council was formed and why it was formed right during the early stages of the conversation about the infrastructure bill.
That's fantastic. I mean, it just really, I think too often in Washington, at least, and I expect it's the same in state capitals as well, coalitions form, I think, without fully formulating kind of the role they can play and kind of true mission objective. And it's just critical what you all are doing. And I think, again, I come back to the conversation a few minutes ago about the focus on your customers and the end users of the service you provide. And ultimately, that has to be a huge driver in the conversation. So I again, congratulations. What I hope is that, maybe 6 months from now, toward the end of season 2, we can get you back on, Carl, and kind of get an update on how things are going, how things for the council, and really, kind of see what the next step is, for the council and for Champaign-Urbana.
That'd be great. We love talking about it.
Carl, if any of our listeners want to learn more about the council, where should we have them go look for more information?
We do have a website, and we are in the process of building it out. It's HFCBusCouncil.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah,
this was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you, as always, to our listeners. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, we will be back with you in 2 weeks for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.